The gleaming rows of cars reflected the late afternoon sun as Barron Trump, now a lanky teenager with a quiet demeanor, stepped into the bustling dealership. It was a place that oozed sophistication, floor-to-ceiling windows, pristine tile floors, and a polished collection of luxury vehicles. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, just a casual visit to admire the engineering marvels that Barron had grown to love. But nothing about that day would turn out ordinary. The manager, a stout man with a sharp suit and sharper tongue named Rick Watterson, had been watching from behind his glass-paneled office. Rick prided himself on keeping his dealership a place of exclusivity, a sanctuary for the wealthy and influential. However, when his eyes landed on Barron, it wasn't admiration for a potential buyer he felt. It was something far less pleasant. Barron moved slowly through the rows of cars, wearing a signature red MAGA hat perched confidently atop his head. For Rick, that hat was like a flashing neon sign, igniting an irrational spark of disdain. He stepped out of his office, his presence commanding attention. His voice boomed across the showroom, a deliberate tactic to ensure everyone within earshot would hear. "Hey kid, we don't allow political advertising here. Take that hat off or leave," Rick barked, his words sharp enough to cut through the polite murmur of sales conversations. Barron turned, his calm blue eyes meeting Rick's with quiet strength. The room seemed to freeze, every pair of eyes shifting to watch the drama unfold. Barron's expression remained composed as he considered the demand, his hand lightly touching the brim of his cap. "It's just a hat," Barron replied, his voice steady, almost too quiet for the room to hear, but those nearby could sense the subtle defiance in his tone. Rick took a step closer, towering over Barron. "This is my dealership, and I make the rules. You either take it off or get out." His voice carried an air of finality, as though he'd already won the exchange. The crowd began to murmur, whispers bouncing between customers and employees alike. Some sided with Rick, citing the need to maintain decorum in the dealership. Others felt a pang of sympathy for the young man, who hadn't done anything to deserve such an unprovoked attack. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he squared his shoulders and took a deep breath, the quiet strength of his upbringing evident in his posture. "I'm not here to advertise anything. I just wanted to look at the cars," he said, his voice firm but respectful. Rick's face flushed with frustration, and he motioned for a security guard to step forward. "You've got 10 seconds to leave," Rick said, counting down as the tension in the room reached a boiling point. As Barron turned to leave, the humiliation clinging to him like a shadow, something changed in the air. The calm, collected young man who had initially walked into the dealership was gone. In his place was someone resolute, quietly determined. What he did next would not only surprise everyone who had witnessed the scene, but would also shake the very foundation of the dealership's reputation. Barron stepped out into the brisk evening air, the dealership's glass doors shutting firmly behind him. He stood for a moment, hands in his pockets, gazing across the lot filled with high-end vehicles shimmering under the showroom lights. There was no anger in his eyes, just contemplation. He pulled his phone from his jacket, typing a quick message, his thumbs moving deliberately over the screen. A few minutes passed before a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows lowering just enough for the driver to peer out. The door swung open, and Barron slipped inside without a word. As the SUV pulled away, Rick Watterson watched from behind the glass, arms crossed over his chest with a satisfied smirk. To him, the matter was settled. But Rick had underestimated one thing: Barron's quiet but powerful network of influence. Later that evening, Barron sat in the lounge of his family's estate, tapping idly at his laptop. The encounter gnawed at him, not because of personal insult, but because of the larger picture. He thought about how easily Rick dismissed him, how quick he was to judge by appearance alone. It wasn't about the hat. It was about control and perception. Barron knew he wasn't the first to be treated like that, and something about it felt wrong. The next morning, without informing anyone, Barron returned to the dealership. This time, he arrived not as a visitor, but as a potential client. He wore no hat, just a crisp black jacket over a casual shirt. Stepping through the doors, He greeted the receptionist politely and requested to speak with the sales director about one of the premium sports models displayed in the center of the floor. The receptionist hesitated for a second, likely recalling the events of the previous day, but eventually nodded. Within minutes, a different salesman, Mark, noticeably friendlier and more polished than Rick, arrived and led Barron to the car of his interest. Mark's professionalism stood in stark contrast to Rick's arrogance. He walked Barron through the features, explaining everything from engine performance to interior customization. Barron listened attentively, asking precise questions, though part of him knew this wasn't just about buying a car, it was about making a point. When the tour ended, Barron thanked Mark and asked for a moment to look around by himself. Mark obliged, disappearing into the office. As Barron strolled between the cars, Rick noticed him from across the floor. His eyes narrowed, and within seconds, he was approaching once more, his displeasure barely masked. "You again?" Rick's tone was dripping with disbelief. "Didn't I make myself clear yesterday?" Barron turned calmly, meeting Rick's gaze without flinching. "I'm here to buy a car," he said simply. Rick scoffed, his arms crossing. "Sure you are. Listen, kid, I don't care who your family is. If you think you can just walk in here and throw money around, you're mistaken." Barron studied Rick for a moment before speaking. "That's an interesting assumption," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "You've judged me twice now without even knowing why I'm here." Rick opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, Mark reappeared, clearly sensing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" Mark asked, his eyes flickering nervously between the two. Barron smiled faintly. "Yes, Mark. Everything's fine. In fact, I've made my decision." Rick arched an eyebrow, the disbelief palpable. "Oh, and which car are you pretending to buy?" Barron's gaze shifted to the sleek, black sports coupe in the center of the room. "That one," he said plainly. Rick's smirk faded for just a second before he chuckled, shaking his head. "Right. That's $250,000, kid. This isn't a toy store." Barron didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and placed a call. His tone was casual, almost dismissive. "Hey, I need the wire process for the car we talked about." "Yeah, the black coupe. Can you confirm with the dealership's manager?" Rick's expression froze. The color drained from his face as the receptionist's phone lit up at her desk. She answered, and within moments, her eyes went wide. She put the call on hold and waved nervously at Rick. It's for you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Rick stepped forward slowly, taking the receiver. "This is Rick." The voice on the other end was brief, direct, and unmistakable. By the time Rick hung up, his demeanor had shifted entirely. Barron watched him quietly, his hands in his pockets. "I believe we were discussing my purchase." Rick nodded stiffly, unable to muster much more than a polite, "Yes, of course." As the paperwork was prepared, Barron stayed silent, observing the frantic energy that rippled across the dealership staff. He wasn't interested in humiliating Rick. This wasn't about revenge. It was about standing tall, and in that moment, Barron realized that quiet confidence often spoke louder than words ever could. As the hours passed, Barron's quiet confidence left a ripple through the dealership. Employees whispered in corners, sneaking glances toward Rick, whose face now wore a forced politeness every time Barron came into view. Mark, the more composed and professional salesman, handled most of the paperwork, but Rick lurked nearby, his presence a reminder of his bruised pride. By the time Barron was ready to sign, a small crowd had gathered discreetly near the edges of the showroom. Even customers had picked up on the tension, watching the unfolding scene with curiosity. Some recognized Barron, but most simply saw a young man making an unusually large purchase, and the dealership's manager struggling to save face. Rick's frustration bubbled just below the surface. He still couldn't believe the turn of events. Yet there he stood, pen in hand, sliding the final paperwork across the desk. Barron reviewed it carefully, his expression unreadable. "You'll need to bring in a valid license and insurance details before we can finalize the release," Rick said, his tone clipped but professional. He couldn't resist one last attempt to remind Barron that despite the sale, the process wasn't over. Barron nodded, taking his time as he placed the signed papers back in Rick's direction. "I'll have that arranged by tomorrow," he replied simply. As Barron stood, Mark escorted him back toward the main showroom. The air between them felt lighter, as though Mark, too, understood the subtle victory Barron had achieved. "I appreciate your help today," Barron said, shaking Mark's hand firmly. "Of course, Mr. Trump. It was a pleasure," Mark replied sincerely. But as Barron reached the exit, his steps slowed. He glanced back over his shoulder, his gaze meeting Rick's one final time. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The air between them hung heavy with unspoken words. Then, without another glance, Barron stepped through the glass doors, disappearing into the evening like a shadow leaving no trace. Rick exhaled slowly, as though shaking off the weight of the encounter. He was ready to put the entire day behind him, to convince himself that it was nothing more than an unpleasant coincidence. But the next day proved otherwise. The dealership phone rang persistently from the moment the doors opened. Requests began pouring in, clients specifically asking for Mark by name, referencing Barron Trump's visit as the reason they wanted to come by. By noon, Rick's frustration was undeniable. "Mark," Rick barked across the showroom floor, waving him over. "What's going on with all these calls?" Mark hesitated, fiddling with the name tag on his suit jacket. "It seems Mr. Trump's visit left an impression," he offered carefully. Rick narrowed his eyes. "What kind of impression?" Mark glanced toward Rick's office, suggesting a private conversation might be better suited. Once inside, Mark lowered his voice, though there was a faint trace of satisfaction behind it. Apparently, Barron shared his experience with a few friends. Word spread. Now, customers want the same treatment he received. Rick's face darkened. "You're telling me they want to be disrespected?" Mark shook his head. "No, they want honesty. I think they saw how Barron was treated at first, and then how he handled it. People respect that. They want to work with someone who listens, not someone who makes snap judgments." Rick sat down heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. This was worse than he thought. Not only had he potentially lost Barron as a future client, but now the entire dealership's reputation had shifted overnight, and not in his favor. But things were far from over. Later that afternoon, as Rick paced the showroom floor, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up outside. Cameras flashed from a distance as Barron stepped out, this time accompanied by his mother, Melania Trump. Her poised elegance filled the room the second she entered. Mark greeted them warmly while Rick hung back, unsure of how to proceed. Melania listened intently as Barron explained the details of his purchase. She nodded approvingly, but her gaze wandered toward Rick, lingering just long enough for discomfort to set in. Barron's eyes flickered toward Rick one last time, and though he said nothing, the unspoken message was clear. Rick swallowed hard as the reality dawned. He hadn't just turned away any ordinary teenager. He had alienated someone whose quiet strength could command attention without raising his voice. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and handshakes. When the coupe finally left the dealership, it wasn't just a car that drove off the lot. It was a reminder that influence isn't always loud. It's often quiet, patient, and, above all, enduring. And as Rick stood watching the taillights disappear into the city, he couldn't help but wonder just how far that quiet influence might reach. Days passed, but the atmosphere at the dealership never quite returned to normal. The ripple effect of Barron Trump's visit continued to linger like an echo that refused to fade. Rick Watterson tried to shift the focus back to his usual clientele, high rollers with fat wallets and no patience for games. But the shift in tone was undeniable. One by one, new customers streamed in, often bypassing Rick completely and asking for Mark by name. Mark, while grateful, couldn't ignore the change. There was a shift in the way people viewed the dealership, and even the staff seemed more cautious in their approach, careful not to make snap judgments or assume anything about the visitors who stepped onto the glossy tile floor. Rick's frustration simmered beneath the surface, though he kept it masked beneath tight smiles and short, clipped conversations. He knew better than to show weakness, but deep down, he felt the weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. Then came the letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, placed neatly on Rick's desk by the receptionist. There was no return address, just his name printed in a precise, elegant script. Rick opened it with faint curiosity, but by the time his eyes reached the end of the single-page message, his face had paled. The letter was from the Trump Organization. It was the realization that he had failed to recognize the power of quiet influence. Later that afternoon, as Rick was reviewing paperwork, another call from the Trump Organization came through. This time, the voice on the line wasn't a sales inquiry. It was a direct request. "Mr. Watterson," the voice began, professional but warm, "Barron Trump would like to return to the dealership for a follow-up visit. Would you be available to meet him personally?" Rick hesitated, fingers lightly drumming against his desk. "Of course," he replied, voice steady though his heart pounded just a bit faster. 2 days later, Barron stepped back into the dealership, his presence just as understated as the first time. He wasn't accompanied by a team or his mother. This time, he arrived alone, wearing a plain jacket and jeans, blending in effortlessly with the other customers browsing the showroom. Rick approached him carefully, offering a polite nod. "Welcome back, Mr. Trump." Barron's gaze met his, but there was no trace of animosity. "Thanks," he replied simply. "I wanted to take another look at the new models." Rick gestured toward the latest line of luxury sedans, keeping his tone neutral. "I'd be happy to show you around." As they walked, Rick found himself asking more questions than providing answers. He was curious, not about Barron's family name or wealth, but about his interests, his thoughts on design, and his eye for detail. Surprisingly, Barron opened up, describing the types of vehicles he admired, the engineering behind them, and even sharing a few stories about cars he had driven alongside his father. By the end of the visit, Rick felt something he hadn't expected, a quiet sense of respect. Barron Trump wasn't just a high-profile name or a symbol of influence. He was a young man with genuine curiosity and humility, navigating the world under a microscope but choosing grace at every turn. As Barron prepared to leave, Rick extended his hand. "Thank you for coming by again. I hope your experience was better this time." Barron shook his hand firmly, offering a slight smile. "It was. I appreciate the time." Rick watched as Barron stepped out into the afternoon sun, disappearing into the city's hum once more. And though nothing grand had been said or done, Rick knew something had shifted. Sometimes, the smallest gestures of respect could rebuild bridges that pride had once burned. A week after Barron's quiet return to the dealership, Rick Watterson found himself reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. The memory of his initial misstep lingered, but there was a strange sense of peace that followed. But just as Rick thought the chapter had closed, another curveball was thrown his way. It started with an email, simple and direct. The subject line read, "Invitation, private event at Trump Tower." Rick squinted at the screen, reading the message twice. The email came from an assistant in the Trump Organization, inviting Rick to a private unveiling of a new luxury vehicle at Trump Tower. It was described as an exclusive event, limited to select individuals in the automotive industry. Rick couldn't help but wonder, was this Barron's doing? When the day arrived, Rick made his way to Manhattan, stepping into the towering glass building that bore the Trump name. The lobby bustled with activity, and uniformed staff guided guests toward an upper floor where the event was being held. As Rick entered the room, the air buzzed with sophistication. Champagne flutes clinked, and conversations hummed beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Positioned in the center of the room was a sleek, unreleased luxury vehicle draped in an elegant black cloth. But it wasn't the car that caught Rick's attention. It was Barron Trump, standing quietly near the far end of the room, engaged in conversation with a group of automotive executives. Dressed sharply but without fanfare, Barron exuded the same calm composure Rick had witnessed at the dealership. Rick hesitated before stepping forward. As if sensing him, Barron's eyes lifted, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He excused himself from the conversation and approached Rick with the same quiet confidence that had reshaped their last encounter. "Mr. Watterson," Barron greeted, offering his hand. Rick accepted the handshake, feeling the weight of the moment. "I appreciate the invitation," Rick said, scanning the room. "This is impressive." Barron's gaze flickered toward the covered car. "I thought you might enjoy seeing the unveiling. It's not every day we introduce something like this." Rick nodded, though he sensed there was more to the invitation than just a car reveal. As the event progressed, Rick observed Barron from a distance. The way he interacted with executives, how he listened more than he spoke, and the way his presence commanded respect. All of it spoke volumes. In crisp, formal language, it detailed Barron's experience at the dealership, recounting every moment from the initial confrontation to the final purchase. There was no request for an apology, no demand for compensation, just a subtle reminder that the Trump family valued respect, professionalism, and fairness in all their dealings. The final line was the most unsettling. "We hope this serves as an opportunity for growth." After all, first impressions are difficult to erase. Rick read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside. He felt the weight of the words, heavier than any fine or reprimand he could have received. Meanwhile, Barron's low-profile demeanor remained unchanged. Despite the buzz surrounding his visit, he stayed out of the public eye, focusing on his interests and keeping a low profile. But behind the scenes, something was shifting. A week later, the dealership phone rang again, this time from a different source. It wasn't a curious customer or a journalist looking for a story. It was an inquiry directly from the Trump Organization's acquisitions team. The message was simple. The Trump family was interested in exploring the possibility of acquiring a new fleet of luxury vehicles for one of their properties, and they wanted to begin the process at Rick's dealership. The catch: they wanted Mark to oversee the entire transaction. Rick could barely mask his irritation as he relayed the news to Mark, though he managed to keep his tone neutral. "Congratulations," Rick said with a tight smile. "It seems you've made an impression." Mark accepted the news graciously, but even he could sense the deeper message at play. This wasn't just about cars. It was about making a point, a reminder that integrity and humility mattered just as much as the product being sold. When the Trump Organization's representatives arrived the following week, it was Barron who accompanied them. This time, there was no confrontation, no hats, and no tension. Barron moved through the dealership quietly, inspecting the cars with a keen eye and exchanging pleasantries with Mark. Rick kept his distance, but every now and then, he caught Barron's gaze. There was no hostility in those eyes, just a quiet acknowledgement, a mutual understanding that no words could express. By the end of the day, the dealership secured one of the largest sales in its history. But for Rick, the real takeaway wasn't in the numbers or the vehicles sold. It was in the reminder that sometimes the smallest interactions leave the deepest impressions. As Barron exited the dealership for the final time, Rick found himself reflecting on the entire experience. He had built his career on assumptions, quick judgments, and the belief that appearances dictated outcomes. But in the end, it wasn't power or wealth that reshaped his perspective. It was the quiet resolve of a young man who chose dignity over confrontation and respect over revenge. And as the sun set over the dealership that evening, Rick Watterson found himself reconsidering the values he thought he understood, and the ones he had yet to learn. In the days following the Trump Organization's record-breaking purchase, the dealership hummed with activity. Sales soared as news of Barron's quiet yet impactful visit spread through local circles. But amidst the newfound attention, Rick Watterson found himself more reserved than usual. The lesson wasn't lost on him, yet something deeper gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. One evening, long after the dealership had closed and the last set of headlights faded into the distance, Rick lingered in his office, staring at the pristine black coupe's photo hanging on his wall. It was a reminder of both triumph and miscalculation. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mark stepped inside, a cautious yet familiar presence. "Long day?" Mark asked, leaning lightly against the doorframe. Rick exhaled slowly. "Something like that." He gestured to the photo. "Funny how much one interaction can change things, isn't it?" Mark smiled, though there was understanding behind his eyes. "You know, Rick, you could have just apologized." Rick chuckled dryly, rubbing his temples. "You think that would have made a difference?" "I do." Mark shifted his weight. "Barron wasn't looking to humiliate you. He just wanted to be treated like anyone else. That's the part you missed. Rick let the words hang in the air, their weight pressing heavier than he expected. Maybe you're right, he admitted, though it felt more like a concession than a realization. The next morning, Rick found himself arriving earlier than usual. He paced the showroom floor, watching the sunlight dance over the car's sleek surfaces. Mark had been right. There was something about the simplicity of the entire encounter that unsettled him. It wasn't about losing a sale, nor was it about pride. It wasn't long before another surprising development occurred. Late one afternoon, as Rick prepared to leave for the day, the receptionist intercepted him with a peculiar smile. "Mr. Watterson," she said, holding out a slim black envelope. "This came for you." Rick furrowed his brow as he accepted the envelope. There was no sender listed, but the seal bore the unmistakable crest of the Trump family. He opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. "Rick, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to meet me at the event. I appreciated the conversation and the respect you showed me. I've arranged for something to be delivered to the dealership later this week. Consider it a token of appreciation for the lesson we both walked away with. Take care, Barron Trump." Rick stared at the note for a long while, curiosity prickling at the edges of his thoughts. A few days later, the delivery arrived. It was a car, not just any car, but a custom luxury model, far rarer and more exclusive than anything the dealership had previously sold. The kind of vehicle that turned heads and captured headlines. Attached to the car was a small placard that read, "For display, courtesy of the Trump Organization." Rick's first instinct was to worry. A car like this could attract all the wrong kinds of attention: envy, scrutiny, questions. But as he watched employees gather around the vehicle in awe, he realized this wasn't about spectacle. It was about perception. The car stood as a silent reminder of growth, how a single act of humility could transform not only relationships but reputations. Customers were drawn to the dealership, not just because of the rare vehicle but because of the story that accompanied it. Rick never framed the letter or displayed it publicly. He kept it in his desk, occasionally reading it during moments of doubt or frustration. It wasn't about holding on to pride, but remembering the value of grace under pressure. As time passed, Rick crossed paths with Barron on occasion, at events, auctions, and industry gatherings. Their exchanges were brief but cordial, always marked by a quiet understanding that extended beyond words. On one such occasion, Rick approached Barron, offering a rare admission. "You were right," Rick said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I am a better businessman now." Barron returned the smile. "I never doubted it." They shook hands, parting ways once more. As Rick watched Barron disappear into the crowd, he couldn't help but marvel at the irony. In an industry built on loud deals and flashy sales, it was the quietest voice that had left the deepest impact. And Rick Watterson knew he'd carry that lesson with him, not just as a businessman, but as a person. Finally, as the cloth was pulled away and the vehicle was revealed, applause filled the room. Cameras flashed, and executives circled the car eagerly. But Rick's attention lingered on Barron, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, observing with a thoughtful gaze. It wasn't long before Barron approached Rick once more. "You know," Barron said, his voice light but deliberate, "I thought about our first encounter for a while." Rick felt his shoulders tense slightly. "I imagine it wasn't the best impression." Barron shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It wasn't about the impression. I've seen how people react to my name, but I wanted to see how you'd react to me." Rick's brow furrowed. "Why?" Barron's gaze shifted toward the sleek vehicle on display. "Because I believe respect is earned, not demanded. I didn't walk into that dealership expecting special treatment. I wanted to see how you treated someone who didn't seem important." Rick absorbed the words, the weight of the realization settling over him. Barron continued, his tone calm. "I know what it's like to be underestimated. People make assumptions about me all the time. But I've learned that how you handle small moments says more about you than anything else." Rick exhaled slowly, nodding. "I misjudged you, and I appreciate the reminder." Barron's faint smile returned. "Everyone misjudges someone eventually. It's what you do after that matters." The event concluded, and as guests began to filter out, Rick lingered near the exit. Before stepping into the elevator, Barron turned back one last time. "You're a good businessman, Mr. Watterson. I just think you'll be an even better one after this." Rick smiled, offering a respectful nod. As the elevator doors closed behind Barron, Rick stood quietly for a moment, letting the words sink in. Sometimes, the most valuable lessons didn't come from boardrooms or high-stakes deals. Sometimes, they came from the quiet influence of those you least expected. In the weeks that followed the unveiling at Trump Tower, Rick Watterson found himself approaching his business with a newfound sense of clarity. The experience had shifted something in him, subtle but lasting. His interactions with customers became more genuine, and the air of arrogance that had once hung over the dealership slowly began to dissipate. Employees noticed the change, though no one dared to speak of it directly. Mark, in particular, observed the quiet shift in Rick's demeanor, sensing that whatever had transpired between him and Barron had left an undeniable mark.